Another edition of Beat the Closing Number presented by TheLines.com. I'm Eli Hershkovich, joined by Matthew Winick. You can follow him on X at Matthew Winick, handicapping Saturday's Elite Eight matchups between Florida and Texas Tech in the West Regional Final, and then Duke and Alabama. High-powered, fast-paced game. Theoretically, we'll handicap it here in a bit in the East Regional Final on Saturday night. How we doing, Matt? How has the NCAA tournament treated you so far?
In terms of a viewing experience, I've had a great time. In terms of a betting experience, up and down, I've had a lot more success in the smaller tournaments, the NIT and the CBI. Just a lot of late game fluctuations and things that looked good that didn't end up being good. And my bracket's a mess, but at this point, I'm having a good time anyways.
I love it. That's all we could ask for. I think I'm one game over and a tad in the green. But considering, as you said, the amount of variance we've seen, it could be a lot worse. Didn't hit going back to Saturday night's or Thursday night's results. Didn't hit with Maryland +7. I also lost my Maryland futures RIP, and it seems like RIP to Kevin Willard in College Park. But I did hit with Arkansas +5.5. That was a sweat. I don't know if you had anything with the total there, but if you had the under, you got your ass kicked.
I did. I did.
Okay. I'm sorry, man.
It's all
How you
good.
feeling?
I feel good knowing that I had the right side more than I feel bad about losing my money.
Yeah, but it sucks.
It sucks, but it's happened to me so many times this year. I'm immune.
Okay, fair enough. On the other hand, I don't want to go as far as saying sweating bullets, but thankfully Brazil hit the 3 at the top of the key to tie the game up. Otherwise, Florida or Tech gets the ball up 3, 1 minute plus left in the game. I think at that point, Red Raiders cover if Brazil doesn't tie the game up. But that's just my intuition. Either way, speaking of Florida and Texas Tech, let's get into the handicap here. Florida opening as a 4.5-point favorite in this Elite Eight matchup. Tip time, 5:09 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. Early evening, I guess we could say. But it was immediately bet up to Florida -6.5. Total open, 155.5. And it's now at anywhere between 156.5 and 157. As I alluded to, Arkansas going down in flames if you had money line or Arkansas futures to win the region or even win the championship or make the title game. John Calipari was 35-0 straight up in the NCAA tournament when leading by 6+ points at halftime. The longest streak ever by a head coach. The next longest was the great John Wooden, going back to the mid-50s through the mid-70s. So once they put that graphic on the screen, you knew Arkansas was toast.
Yeah.
Even though they were up, double digits with about 4 minutes and change left of the game. I don't know how John L. Davis didn't get a shot up to end regulation and B, down 2 at the end of overtime. But I digress here. Biggest storyline goes without saying. Does Chance McMillan play for Texas Tech? Missing the last 4 games with an upper body injury, 4+ games for that matter. He participated in shoot-around on Thursday night. On the flip side, Alex Condon, maybe the ankle swells up a bit more. He re-entered the game against Maryland in the second half, played about 14 minutes in total, finished with 6 points, 4 rebounds, and a block, and had that huge play under 12 minutes, about 11:30 left in regulation. Somehow throws the ball up in the air, hand-glocked, and collects it for the putback, or if you want to call it an assist, I'll give it to you. And Florida never looked back from there. And at that point in the game, they were up by 8. So maybe it didn't play a role in Florida winning the game outright one way or the other. But at least for my Maryland ticket, I knew it was over once that putback was in. But how are you handicapping this one on the surface, my man?
Yeah, to me, the biggest, matchup game here is Texas Tech being one of the smallest power conference teams in the nation and Florida's overwhelming size 4-5. I mean, with Texas Tech, Federico had some important minutes in their game last night, but he still only played, 13 minutes. They're going to have to do a lot of him and Toppin against the 4-man big man rotation of Condon, Huff, Chinyulu, and Micah Handlogden. And that's a problem because Darion Williams is a nightmare matchup at the 4 offensively. If he's playing predominantly the 3, I think that hampers Texas Tech's offense. But with the way that they're going to have to defend this Florida attack and the way that Florida crashes the offensive glass, the personnel is going to be the real question. And I'm a huge Grant McCasland guy. I think he's one of the 5, probably 10 best coaches in college basketball. I think he'll figure it out. And Texas Tech was the #1 defensive rebounding team in the Big 12 this season. But I'm worried about them in the paint, and I'm worried about them on the glass. Not to mention, I'm worried about who's guarding Walter Clayton because their guards are small.
Great points. Elijah Martin. Well, not Elijah Martin, Elijah Hawkins. There's also Elijah Martin in this game, but
Yeah.
Hawkins against Clayton is a complete mismatch. And to your point about rebounding and just post-up play, I guess, or pick and roll action for that matter for JT Toppin and Texas Tech offensively, I was digging into some of the numbers. So Florida, not elite on the defensive glass, but as you said very well, size-wise, they have an advantage. And their pick and roll defense grades in the 83rd percentile on a points per possession basis per synergy. That is huge against Toppin. And as we saw, especially in the second half, it mattered a lot against Julian Reese. Low post action, pick and roll, even with Derek Queen. I think Queen had a nice cut on one of their first couple possessions in the second half when Reese had a low post touch. But other than that, Maryland couldn't get much going with their pick and roll game, which was a byproduct of Florida's really sound pick and roll defense. And on the flip side, Texas Tech's transition defense doesn't grade super well according to Synergy. I believe in the 37th, 39th percentile, somewhere in that ballpark. So if you can't match up and Florida's controlling the tempo because of their size advantage, I don't see a path to back Texas Tech on the point spread, even a small money line bet here. I don't really have a play on the total. Now, I will say my only intuition for the total, and I know we were kind of going back and forth about this before the podcast started, Texas Tech coming off of an overtime win, and you can go back to the conference tournaments for sure. Maybe the market's steaming this line up. Has you considering Texas Tech just with the notion that off of overtime, maybe it won't play as big of a role, even if McMillan doesn't come back. But you look at Texas Tech's 3-game sample size in the tournament, they're shooting 25% from 3. Their opponents are shooting 36.8 from 3. Now, you could say, okay, regression to the mean. Over a 3-game sample size, I'm not one who's willing to go that far, because we've seen 4-game sample sizes hold up in the tournament where teams just don't shoot well. And tired legs, if they can't get their legs underneath their shots, and again, your best 3-point shooter in McMillan doesn't suit up, my only take would be, with that in mind, maybe a play on the under. I have nothing for you on the side. I'm obviously not going to take a piece on the money line here, but with tired legs in mind and maybe Texas Tech's 3-point shooting was continuing, I would look towards an under. That's my only avenue for a bet here.
For me, I mean, I'm not the biggest tired legs guy in the world, especially with college athletes in a spot as big as this with the day off. But I think you're on the right track. I think the under is the right side, and it's something that I'm definitely leaning towards potentially playing. You mentioned Texas Tech isn't a great transition defense in terms of efficiency, but they are a great transition denial defense. They only allow it at a 7th percentile rate. And Florida themselves are a fantastic transition defense. Texas Tech, with their smaller rotation and lack of size, and quite honestly, lack of talent compared to Florida in this game, I think they're going to try to make this a crawl. And Grant McCasland knows how to make a game a crawl. Remember, he was the coach of North Texas for half a decade, and they were one of the slowest teams in the country year after year. He can do that, especially if, and as I mentioned before, there's a lot of Toppin and Federico lineups, more Williams at the 3. That is a defensive lineup for Texas Tech. Federico, in quad 1 games, Texas Tech has a defensive rating that's 4 points higher when he's on the floor versus off, and their offensive rating drops. I think there's a chance that in order to match up with Florida's physicality, Texas Tech throws more defensive lineups out there and slows the pace down. Not to mention the 3-point shooting. The under makes more sense to me because it's already pretty darn high for a game that won't hit 70 possessions. I'd be quite stunned if it does. And it would require a lot of efficiency for it to get over that total.
I'm with you, and I think we might have an angle here. I think my take, potentially, and even if you don't want to go that far, if Texas Tech is either A, some tired legs. Maybe it impacts their three-point shooting, whether it does or doesn't. The Frederico lineup with Toppin at the 4, as you said, definitely is more predicated to defensive efficiency in terms of a positive for Texas Tech rather than playing towards their offensive efficiency. And you go back to McCaslin's North Texas days, they were what? If I want to pull it up here.
Bottom 5. Every year, bottom 5.
Right. Yeah, and it's been the exact opposite for him at Tech, and rightfully so. But you have to play with a defensive mindset in order to beat Florida. The other thing, too, with that in mind, even if it's Toppin and Frederico at the 4 and the 5 for Texas Tech, let's say McCaslin decides to go with the more defensive-minded lineup throughout this game, Florida still has the 5th best offensive rebounding rate. So if Florida isn't shooting efficiently, but you're getting second chance opportunities, you're therefore, in a sense, depending on the length of the possession, draining clock off of pulling the ball back behind the arc. Now, of course, those second chance rebounds can go for second chance points quickly down low, but to me, this has more of the snail pace effect, especially with my thought that Texas Tech's tired legs could continue to impact their three-point shooting. So I'm actually going to play the under here.
There you go. And I'll give you one more quick stat just to make you feel even better. In quad 1 games for Texas Tech, in the 90 minutes when Federico and Toppin share the floor, their defensive rating is 99, when in all other minutes it's 109. So that's a 10-point defensive rating increase when the two share the floor in quad 1 games, meaning that their defense is excellent when the two play together.
The only, right, and well said.
They have to play together. We have to be right about this lineup thing, though.
Right, which I think we will be, but
I do.
The only question is, in terms of either playing the total Friday, early Saturday morning, or waiting on it, if McMillan plays, it's gonna go up, whether it's an adjustment from the books or get bet up, a combination of the two, one way or another. I'm probably gonna wait with that in mind, because even if McMillan doesn't play, I don't think this goes down much. I would say it's going to get bet up, adjusted more so if he does play rather than the other way around.
Probably.
Okay. So a lean, we'll put it that way, to the under.
You got it.
All right. How about that? An agreement off the top. I didn't even know I was going to go in with a potential take on that side of the total. But
here we are.
We love it. Here we are. We love it. That's why these conversations are so fun. That's why we love having Matthew Winick on the show. Let's keep it going here on Beat the Closing Number with the second of 2 Elite Eight games on Saturday. 1 seed Duke against 2 seed Alabama. Duke opening as a 6.5-point favorite. That line hasn't budged much, but the total, speaking of totals, opening around 166.5, and it is anywhere between 172.5 and 174 as we record this on Friday afternoon. Check out the latest odds over at thelines.com. Taking a look back at the Sweet 16, Duke and Arizona. In their matchup, where Arizona backdoor covered in the final 8+ minutes of that game. Wild. Both teams combining to shoot 51.1% from behind the arc on Thursday night in Newark. And Alabama, if you want to talk about an onslaught from 3, 25 three-pointers, not only an NCAA tournament record for a single game, but only one team has ever made more in a win over a Division I opponent ever. And that is Davidson in 2017 against Charleston Southern. That is not a made-up stat. So Alabama comes into this one not on an emotional high, but a shooting high off of an absurd 3-point clip against, let's face it, a bad BYU defense. Credit to you. You had Alabama ATS. And on the flip side, Cooper Flagg, 36, 7, and 3. The first Duke player to post 35 and 5 in a tournament game since the assist stat became official in 84. And he's also the first player to put up 35 and 5 at least in one, and also to have one or fewer turnover since Chris Mullen in 85. So a bunch of offensive stats I'm throwing at you. How are you looking to play this if you are at all?
Yeah, this number is now 7 points off of KenPom's total. And I get it. Like, the entire world just watched Alabama put on the offensive display of a lifetime. But the thing about that is BYU, and I had this quoted on my Twitter, and this is something I was screaming to the masses. BYU is a first percentile dribble defense. So if you can, Alabama is a drive and kick offense. The drive part was so easy for them because BYU has no any level of defensive penetration off that dribble. Alabama was scoring off of drive, two dribbles, kick to an open shooter, drive, two dribbles. They took 77% of their shots from three, and they took 42 catch and shoot three attempts. Duke's allowed more than 23 once all season. So Duke's not going to allow just dribble, dribble, catch and shoot, dribble, dribble, catch and shoot. They're an elite transition defense, number one in the entire country in terms of transition points allowed, the fewest. They're an elite rim denial. They're an elite catch and shoot denial, and they're the tallest team in the country. If Alabama can get 80 points on this Duke team, who's unbelievable at limiting pace and unbelievable at limiting three-pointers, I will tip my cap and say, Alabama, you're the best offensive team I've ever seen, and move forward. I've made a point to back Duke at every chance possible because I don't think numbers in the market truly understand how dominant this team is and what the metrics are really saying. And to me, when I look at this, I think there's too much baked into what Alabama did against BYU, which you have to admit is at least some level of an aberration. I think Duke covers, and I think this goes under. One is a lot more of a safe pick, let's say, than the other.
I'm with you. I think I'm not going to have a piece on the side in this game or the point spread, but if I had to bet it, I would bet Duke. Their length is completely different than what Alabama just squared off against. Yeah. Now, in terms of the under, Duke controlling the pace, also with that in mind, 264th nationally in adjusted pace. So not only a much more stout defense than BYU, but they play at a slower tempo. So that correlates to the under. Now, the one thing that I go back and forth on, because as I alluded to with Texas Tech, a 3-game sample size is a 3-game sample size. Regression isn't always going to come. Maybe Tech shoots 25% again from three, especially if McMillan isn't back, or maybe he plays 14 minutes and takes 2 shots. Who knows? Alabama could very well shoot, maybe not 50%, but 40% from three in this game. That's where I go back and forth. You know Nate Oates isn't going to stray away from playing up tempo in this game, especially with Duke's slower pace. He's going to want to speed this up win the shot volume battle. That's what you're going to have to do to not only cover the point spread, but beat Duke. Alabama, mind you, couldn't cover the point spread against UConn last year in the Final Four, despite either winning at halftime or it was a 3-point game somewhere in that margin. And they were, I would have to actually go back. I want to pull up the numbers to see where the shot volume battle was at for Alabama. And it's not like Duke and Alabama are completely similar, but
I've got you here. UConn won the rebounding 37-29.
Okay,
and
what about
won
shot
the turnovers 8-4.
What about shots?
Alabama took 58 shots and UConn took 62. So that would be only a 4-point edge for UConn.
Okay. Right. And it's not like UConn and Duke are completely similar. They're not to their profiles, roster construction, etc. But I think the point that you brought up is warranted in the fact that the market is power rating Duke to a degree like they did with UConn over the last couple of years in the tournament. That's where I think the similarities show, and that's where it's extremely hard to go to the window and say, I'm backing the underdog here. Because even if you think Alabama can hang in the shot volume battle like they did with UConn, lose that by 4, they're not going to shoot 50+% from three. Mark Sears isn't going to hit 8+ threes, whatever it was. They could shoot 40+, they could shoot 35%+, but they're not getting the efficiency that they got against BYU.
No, they're not. And I think at the end of the day, it's just a physicality, it's a size thing. Like BYU's perimeter defense basically said, we will deny the rim. And they did deny the rim for what it's worth because they knew that Alabama was way bigger and could get to the rim if they wanted to. They said, no rim, beat us from three. And they were stubborn in that approach to the point where, okay, they're going to eventually start missing. The difference between BYU and Duke is Duke doesn't have to play that way because they have a 7'2 rim protector, a 6'10 rim protector, and now back from injury, another 6'10 rim protector, Malik Brown, who's their best overall defender, even better than Cooper Flagg, at least per advanced analytics.
He is.
So Duke doesn't have to let Alabama play one type of way. They can let them play neither type of way. And that's the type of style that I think Alabama can only get to the rim or shoot threes because their offense and their style doesn't allow you to do anything else. Duke's defense basically wants you to do everything else, and Alabama's going to be put into a bit of a corner here, I think.
If we had to pick between the two totals,
yeah,
the under in Duke, Alabama, and the under in Texas Tech, Florida. And again, I didn't come into this podcast thinking I was going to say this. I would probably say under in Texas Tech, Florida.
I'm going to say under in Duke, Alabama, and hate myself for it, but I'm going to say it. And the reason why is I can't get behind a total that is 6 points higher than KenPom. 6 is a lot. And
do you know what it was for BYU, Alabama, just comparatively speaking?
Yeah, I can tell you right now. The KenPom line for Alabama BYU was at 173, and I believe it closed at 75.5.
Okay, so 2 points. Okay, yeah, 2-3 points.
For a first percentile dribble defense in BYU, the line went up 2 points. But now we just saw Alabama put on an onslaught like we've never seen before, and so we're like, oh, 2 points wasn't enough. Let's juice it up 6. And that's fine and good until you realize you're playing the best transition defense in the country, the number one defense in the country, and a team that can control the pace against Alabama like no one else in the country can. And I get like boosting it a point or two like they did with BYU, but 6 is just an egregious amount in my opinion.
Two things for me to wrap with the total conversation. With Duke, Alabama, like Florida, Texas Tech, I think it's fair to wait. Because
definitely.
This, with public money coming in on Saturday, not that public money moves the line, but you're going to get an onslaught of overbets. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. On Saturday night. So you could see this total closing anywhere 174.5, 175, even though it has dipped a bit from the peak of 174 at some shops. I think Circa, for instance, is hanging at a 173.5 right now. So whether you like, or even if, let's say you don't like, our takes about the under for each game. But if you do, I can make the case, and I will make the case, to wait on both of those totals. I guess my point with liking Florida, Texas Tech a little bit more, and we disagree on this to an extent, tired legs to me coming into a play with Texas Tech's three-point shooting and getting their legs underneath them, and also with Florida's ability, even though the tempo on both sides, granted, Texas Tech could try to play it a little bit slower, but if Florida is winning the rebounding battle, they're going to want to play a little bit more up-tempo. But winning the offensive rebounding battle, too, correlates to me with longer possessions for Florida, which play more to the under. So intuition-wise and numbers-wise, that's kind of why I like the Florida-Texas Tech under a little bit more, because for me, it's truly just numbers for Alabama and Duke, where if Alabama shoots 40% from three, not 50%, but 40%, this may be just a chalky over that goes over.
Possible. Yeah, I hate saying that I like Duke, Alabama. Stylistically, you're right. I agree with you. Stylistically, the reason why Texas Tech, Florida goes under makes more sense. But when you're giving me a 4-point head start over where I would make it, I would put the total in Alabama Duke over what KenPom has. So don't get me wrong, but even if I'm putting it 2 points over, you're still giving me a 4-point head start, and that's something that I'm going to probably try to capitalize on.
One last part of this conversation, if we go back to, let's use the analytics of Torvik and KenPom and Haslametrics for that matter, because if you look at the point spread, and this is just the one that comes to mind for me in last year's national championship, Purdue was a shorter underdog. per all those analytical resources than what they were per the betting market. Similarly, KenPom, Torvik, Haslametrics all have this projected total shorter than what it is in the market. So is it an adjustment? Rightfully so by the market. And I'm in agreement with you. Like I touched on, if I had to bet a piece of the total, I may wind up betting the under anyways on Duke, Alabama. But do you get my point there?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's both. Like I said, I would make this above what KenPom has it, and I don't think that he's necessarily correct because there's more elements to this than meets the eye, at least from a numbers perspective. But it's just a sheer how high it's climbed, and I'm not surprised. I'm not thinking to myself, because sometimes I'll think, why in the world is this climbed? I get completely why it's climbed so high. That doesn't mean that it's right, right? So if you're talking about Purdue, UConn, and obviously the number wouldn't have mattered that much because UConn is what UConn is, and they still ended up, winning by 15. But it doesn't change the fact that if something is 5 points off of analytical projections and if you can't match that number to that extent, then there's inherently value. Obviously, there's a bigger microscope on this particular game than the 150 game slate Saturday slates that we'll have in January when that happens. Like, where I'll typically just auto take anything that's super far off of KenPom if I don't have the understanding as to why. I get why, but when it's amplified to this extent, that you can sort of pick whether it's gone overboard.
Very well said. And really fun podcast with Matthew Winick. You can follow him on X at Matthew Winick. 1 N, 2 W's, back to back. Great handicapper. You're going to want to read his thoughts on X, also ahead of Sunday's matchups. And a reminder for those of you who aren't in our free Discord channel, where you could find all of our staff bets in real time ahead of the articles. Again, it's free, not touts, not doing anything like that. Check it out over at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner. I also announced we're doing a live Sunday show at 11 a.m. Eastern. So if you want to check out that show, you're more than welcome to here on YouTube. Just hit the thumbs up button if you like the content and you want to get notified when our live show occurs on Sunday. Again, it's at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. You'll get that notification by subscribing to the YouTube channel. Also, you have a chance to win $250 daily throughout the rest of the NCAA tournament in our free March Madness Pick'em contest over at play.thelines.com. Remember to check out the best odds and sportsbook promos, for that matter, over at thelines.com as well throughout the rest of the NCAA tournament. Matt, any last words before we get out of here?
Let's enjoy these last little bits and pieces of the college basketball season. I miss it already, and it's not even done.
Well said. Thank you to Matthew Winick for joining me here on the show, and thank you for everyone who watched and listened to Beat the Closing Number, presented by thelines.com. So long, everybody, and good luck with your Saturday Elite Eight bets.